There's a thing they never tell you about standing post. Not in training, not in the briefings, not even in the quiet conversations that happen between shifts when the older guards, the ones with 4, 5 deployments behind their eyes, sit with their tea, going cold, and say almost nothing useful. Nobody tells you about the listening. You'd think the job is about standing still, about the posture, the bearing, the boots so polished they catch the gray London sky like a mirror. You'd think it's about endurance, about the legs that ache after hour 2, about the spine that wants to curve even when the brain won't let it. You'd think the discipline of it is physical. It isn't. The discipline is in the ears. My name is Sergeant Daniel Okafor. Dan to nobody on post, Okafor to the unit, Danny to my mom back in Peckham who still worries about my cholesterol, and I have been standing outside the ceremonial post attached to the household division for 11 years. 11 years. That means close to 4,000 individual shifts, give or take. That means I have listened to more human sound than most people accumulate in 3 lifetimes. Rain on the gate. Wind coming down the mall in the autumn like something personal. Tourists with their phones, their languages, their excitement pressing against the fence like bread dough. And breathing. I have listened to so much breathing. I know what ordinary breathing sounds like. I know what nervous breathing sounds like, that short, thin quality, like someone trying to drink through a coffee stirrer instead of a straw. I know what a person sounds like when they've jogged from the tube stop and haven't told their lungs yet. I know what a child breathing sounds like when they're about to cry. I know what breathing sounds like at 3 a.m. in January when the cold has its hands around your chest and every inhale costs something. I know breathing like some men know music. What I heard that morning at 9:14 on a Thursday in late September was wrong. It was the wrong breathing, coming from the wrong person. The morning had started the way all of them do. You don't ease into a shift at the palace. There's no warming up, no gentle on-ramp. You step into position and you become the position. The ceremony of it, the bearskin, the scarlet tunic, the rifle, it's not costuming. It's architecture. You're a piece of the building, a moving column, breathing stonework. The weather was doing that stubborn London thing where it can't commit to being properly awful, so it settles for being persistently unpleasant. That low gray sky that isn't quite raining but won't let you forget it could. The tourists were out in their usual density. Families from every continent on Earth pressed against the railings, cameras up. A school group in yellow high-vis vests trying to exist as a unit, while 34 individual children ran their own 34 separate agendas. A man selling umbrellas from a trolley near the gates, calling out in a voice like a cheerful foghorn. Everything normal. Everything correctly, boringly, predictably normal. I was in a secondary post that morning, not the sentry box directly at the gate, but the adjacent position slightly back and to the left. The position that tourists photograph less. The one that doesn't feature on the postcards. I'd been there since 8 o'clock, and I had 50 minutes left in the current rotation when I became aware of something. Not a sound, exactly. Not yet. More like the absence of the right sound. Guardsman Ellis was at the primary box. Marcus Ellis, 22 years old, 18 months in. Built like someone had assembled a man from the spare parts of several larger men. Shoulders that seemed to arrive in a room before the rest of him. Hands that could palm a watermelon like it was a cricket ball. On paper, he was everything. In practice, he was still becoming everything. You can always tell. The ones still becoming. They have a quality about them like a guitar string tuned slightly too tight. Functional. Resonant. But tuned too tight. I'd worked alongside Ellis maybe a dozen times. He was good. Serious in the way that young men who've worked hard for something tend to be serious. He took the post with both hands. But I never stood close enough to him to know his breathing. That morning, for a reason I couldn't have articulated if you'd asked me, I was paying attention. It started as a rhythm problem. That's the only way I can describe it. Like a song where the time signature has been very slightly altered. You wouldn't catch it if you weren't already listening for it. But I was always listening. That's the thing. And what I caught was this. Ellis was breathing fractionally faster than he should have been. Not much. Not a panting, obvious, something's wrong kind of fast. We're talking 4, maybe 5 extra breaths per minute above what I'd have expected given the temperature, the exertion, and the amount of time he'd been on post. Most people would hear nothing. I heard a clock ticking one beat too quick. I let it sit. Let it be nothing. Let it be a cold he was fighting, or a bad night's sleep, or the particular way the wet air was hitting his lungs that morning. I let it be harmless for about 90 seconds. Then, the pattern changed. Fast, I could explain. Fast is nerves. Fast is cold. Fast is a dozen ordinary things. What changed was the texture of it. The breaths became shallow. Very slightly. The kind of shallowness that happens when the chest is doing something the body doesn't want to advertise. When every inhale is being carefully rationed. Like someone measuring water they're not sure they'll have enough of. Then there was the hold. Just for fraction. After each inhale, before each exhale, a pause. Autoini, involantary halt. Not a technique. Not deliberate. The body doing it because the body is managing something the brain hasn't processed yet. I know that pause. I've had that pause. That pause is what happens when something in your environment has activated your threat response, and your training is fighting your instinct for control of your next 3 seconds. That pause is fear. The thing about fear in a man who's been trained not to show it is that it doesn't look like fear. It doesn't have the obvious texture. No wide eyes. No visible trembling. No audible gasp. It goes underground. It hides in involuntary systems, the ones training can't fully reach. The microsystems, the small machinery of the body running on programs older than language. The breathing. Always the breathing. I kept my eyes front, kept my posture exact, kept my expression the administrative blank that the post requires. But every sense I had was now pointed at Ellis like a compass finding north. Something in the area around his box had activated his threat response. Something he clocked. Something I hadn't. The question wasn't whether I trusted what I was hearing. I've been doing this for 11 years. I trusted it the way you trust a bad smell before you found the source. The smell isn't wrong just because you can't see it yet. The question was, what had he seen? I began the slow expansion of my attention, keeping the face still, keeping the body absolutely motionless, but letting the peripheral vision do its work. It's a skill. 11 years of it. You learn to see without appearing to look. You learn to use your eyes like sonar rather than a spotlight. The school group was still generating its cheerful chaos 20 feet to my left. The umbrella man was doing brisk business. 1 sale, 2, a brief negotiation in what sounded like Portuguese. A couple was taking a selfie with their backs to the gate, laughing at something on the screen. A man in a gray coat, middle-aged, unremarkable, the kind of face you'd forget before you'd finished looking at it, was standing perhaps 8 meters from Ellis's box. He was not taking a photograph. He was not consulting his phone. He was not speaking to anyone. He was standing very still, facing the box, and he had been there, I tried to calculate, for at least 3 minutes. 3 minutes of stillness while the tourist ecosystem moved and swirled around him like water around a stone. There's a category of attention we're trained to recognize. Not the gawking attention of a first-time visitor. Not the patient attention of a photography enthusiast waiting for the light to change. Not even the slightly too long stare of someone daring themselves to shout or wave. There is an attention that has weight to it. A focused, measuring quality, like the person producing it is doing math. The man in the gray coat had that kind of attention. His eyes were on Ellis. Not on the gate. Not on the palace. On Ellis specifically. Tracking. Calculating. The face neutral in the way that faces are neutral when they're working very hard at it. I felt the back of my neck do the thing it does. And I understood then what Ellis had already heard in himself, what his body had already decided before his brain had the vocabulary for it. The man in the gray coat was not a tourist. The hardest thing in this job isn't the cold. People always assume it's the cold. November at the gate, February at the gate, the kind of cold that finds the gaps in any uniform and settles there like a slow tenant. People see you standing in it, and they marvel, or they feel guilty, or they take your photograph with expressions that say better you than me. They think the cold is the challenge. It isn't. The hardest thing is the staying still when every signal in your body is telling you to move. When the ancient machinery of you, the part that predates language, predates ceremony, predates the uniform and the post, and 11 years of accumulated discipline. When that part wakes up and sends a message up through your feet and your spine and into your chest and says, something is wrong here. Move. Do something. Move now. And the training says stay. And you stay. You stay because leaving the post without cause creates more risk than holding it. You stay because your presence is the deterrent. You stay because your absence creates a variable, and variables are what bad actors are looking for. And giving a potential threat a variable is handing them a gift. So you stay, and you listen. Ellis's breathing was now telling me three distinct things. First, he'd already identified the man in the gray coat. Whatever the initial trigger had been, a look, a gesture, a quality of stillness that my position made harder to parse. Ellis had clocked it. His body had clocked it before his training vocabulary caught up. Second, he was managing, actively managing. The breaths were shallow but rhythmic, which meant he was applying something, not letting it run free, not going under. He was keeping the surface clean. Anyone watching his face would have seen nothing. A wall, architecture, but the machinery underneath was running hot. Third, and this was the one that made the back of my neck stay cold even after I'd identified the source. The managing was costing him. You can hear it when composure is expensive. There's a quality of effort to it, like a man rowing against a current who's learned to make it look like he's drifting. He was holding, but he'd been holding alone for however long this had been happening before I'd started paying attention. The man in the gray coat hadn't moved. I now had a full picture of him built into my peripheral vision without ever having turned my head. Maybe 55. Average height, a few centimeters under 6 feet. The coat was ordinary, off the rack, the kind sold in every high street from Aberdeen to Southampton. Dark gray, belted loosely. He had the kind of posture that's been trained somewhere. Not military, not obviously, but something institutional. A school, a firm, a discipline of some kind that had settled into his spine and stayed. His hands were in his coat pockets. Both of them. In early October, that's not remarkable. But the hands weren't moving in the pockets. Not the small, unconscious fidgeting of a cold man looking for warmth. Still, like object placed there. And the face was neutral isn't quite right. Neutral implies the absence of expression. What he had was something more controlled. An expression that had been chosen. The expression of a man performing ordinariness. Performed ordinariness is its own kind of giveaway. I had options. I'm going to tell you what they were because I think it matters. Because people assume this kind of situation is all instinct, all adrenaline, all muscle memory engaging before the brain gets its coat on. And there's some truth to that, but not all of it. Option 1. I could trigger the discretionary communication, the barely visible signals we have for passing information between posts without obvious radio contact or movement. A specific micro-shift of posture. A coded stillness. Option 2. I could wait. Continue gathering information. Let the situation develop or resolve at its own pace while keeping Ellis in my peripheral hearing. Option 3. If the threat escalated to an active, visible, imminent threshold, if the hands came out of those pockets and that threshold was met, the protocol that nobody wants to discuss out loud, but that everyone on this job knows by heart. The choice between these options is not made emotionally. That's the thing the films get wrong. In the films, the protagonist feels fear and then acts from the fear heroically, instinctively. In reality, the fear becomes information. You file it. You route it through the appropriate filter. And then you make the rational choice with the frightened body as your instrument. I chose option 2. Wait, watch, listen to Ellis's breathing, and see if the cost of holding was becoming too high. The school group shifted. A teacher, young woman, harassed expression, the energy of someone herding butterflies for a living, moved her charges 20 feet along the fence, pointing at something on the gate with the enthusiasm of a person who has described this same gate to 37 different school groups and has not yet entirely lost the will to care. The shuffle of 34 children created a minute change in the crowd geometry. And in that shuffle, I saw the man in the gray coat do something. Small, very small. He took one step to the right. Just one. A minor lateral adjustment. Something a casual observer might attribute to wanting a better angle, or stepping clear of a child who'd wandered into his space. But it wasn't that. It was a sightline correction. He'd lost visual confirmation of Ellis for approximately 2 seconds as the children moved, and he'd adjusted his position to reestablish it. That is not tourist behavior. That is a man maintaining surveillance on a specific target. Ellis heard the step. I know he heard it because the breathing changed again. What had been shallow and managing became, for exactly 4 seconds, stopped. Not a pause. Not the tiny involuntary hold I'd noticed earlier. A held breath. Deliberate. The kind that happens when your processing demand peaks and your body temporarily borrows from non-essential systems. 4 seconds is a long time to not breathe when you're standing at a ceremonial post in front of 400 tourists. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then it resumed. The exhale came out with the smallest possible signature. Controlled, measured, not a gasp, not a release, but managed in a way that told me Ellis was working harder than anyone standing near him would ever have suspected. He was scared. He was managing the scared. And he was doing it alone, because as far as he knew, nobody else had noticed. Here is the thing I need to tell you about that moment. That moment, watching a 22-year-old man hold 4 seconds of fear in his chest without moving a muscle, without breaking posture, without giving the surveillance the variable it was waiting for. That was one of the most precise, expensive acts of courage I have ever witnessed. Not cinematic courage. Not the kind that makes good footage. The quiet kind. The kind that costs everything and shows nothing. The kind that is easy to miss because it looks from any external angle like a man standing still. I made my choice. The microsignal. The barely there shift. A fractional change in my head's axis that means, in our abbreviated vocabulary, I see it too. I'm here. Hold. It took a quarter of a second to deliver. And I watched Ellis receive it. Not with any visible reaction. Not with a look, a twitch, a change in his bearing. But the breathing. The breathing changed. Not to calm. I'm not telling you it resolved the situation or dissolved the fear. It didn't. But the quality of it shifted. The expensive, managed quality. The one that sounded like a man rowing against a current, softened by a single degree. Because he wasn't alone in it anymore. Because someone else was carrying part of the weight. That's what the signal meant, really, underneath its procedural purpose. I hear you. I'm here. You're not in this alone. The breathing that comes after someone knows they're not alone. I know that sound too. It sounds like the smallest, most compressed version of relief that the human body can manufacture without anyone seeing it. The man in the gray coat shifted his weight. Forward. Fractionally. Both feet moving. A readjustment, or the beginning of one. The hands still in the pockets. The face still performing its careful ordinariness. But the weight was forward now. A person at rest leans back. A person walking has their weight centered. A person about to initiate something, to move, to approach, to close distance, shifts their weight forward. The body organizes itself for what it's already decided. I saw it, and I heard Ellis's breath do something I can only describe as bracing. One long, deliberate intake. Not fast, not panicked, measured. The way you breathe when you're about to lift something heavy and you want every molecule of oxygen available when you need it. The breath of a man who has finished waiting. And then, before the weight could become movement, before the hands could come out of the pockets, before the gray coat closed the 8 meters of distance, 3 things happened in rapid, overlapping sequence. A radio crackled. Distant, but not distant enough. Not our radios. His. The man in the gray coat heard it first. His head moved, barely, a micro flinch in the direction of his left lapel. There was something in there. Something transmitting. Something that had just changed the information he was operating on. His weight shifted back. Centered. The forward lean resolved itself into a neutral stand. His hands came out of his pockets. Empty. He turned. Not quickly. Not with the urgency of flight, but with the deliberate, measured turn of man who has received different instructions. And he began to walk. South. Along the pavement outside the gate, toward the road that bends toward Birdcage Walk, past the umbrella seller who'd run out of things to sell, and was eating his sandwich with great commitment. He walked. He was gone in 40 seconds, swallowed by the gray London morning the same way he'd arrived in it, seamlessly, without texture, without a trace worth pointing at. Ellis exhaled, long, slow, everything he'd been holding in his chest for however long that had been. 10 minutes? 15? Time moves differently on the post, and it moves differently again when fear is reconfiguring it. The exhale was almost inaudible. Almost. I heard it. In 11 years, I have heard every kind of breath this job produces, and the breath Ellis released when that gray coat disappeared into the crowd was a specific kind. I've only heard it a handful of times. It's the breath you hear after a very close thing, after a margin that held, after fear that was real, that had genuine content, that was measuring something actual, as resolved without becoming the thing it was measuring. It sounds like relief. It sounds like ground under your feet again after ice. It sounds like someone very young finding out they had more in them than they thought. The relief came, and we withdrew, and the ceremony of handing off the post happened the way it always happens, with precision, with ritual, with the economy of men who have performed a thing so many times it has shed all its excess. Ellis, and I didn't speak. You don't, immediately after. There's a decompression that happens in the first few minutes off post, a slow return from the architectural to the human, and trying to put language to something before that decompression completes is like trying to discuss a film while it's still running. The words don't land right. They glance off. We walked back through the internal route in silence. I noticed Ellis's hands. They were very slightly unsteady, a fine tremor, barely visible, the kind that happens when the adrenaline that's been held in chemical suspension is finally allowed to move. He'd have noticed it too. He'd have been cataloging it in the private, slightly embarrassed way that young men catalog the evidence of their own fear, looking at his hands and registering that they were doing something he hadn't told them to do. I didn't say anything about the hands. Some things need to metabolize quietly before anyone names them. We ended up in the small anteroom off the main corridor, the one with the bench that's missing a bolt so it rocks slightly whenever you sit on it, and the window that faces the interior courtyard, and the radiator that makes a sound like a very old man trying to open a jar. Somebody had left half a pack of biscuits on the bench. Digestives, which I find depressing as biscuits go, but Ellis apparently didn't, because he ate 3 in quick succession without appearing to taste them. I poured tea from a canteen urn, a liquid that technically qualifies as tea the way a puddle technically qualifies as water, and handed him a mug. He took it. We sat. The radiator opened its jar. "You heard it," he said. Not a question. "I heard it," I said. He nodded, looked down at the mug. The tea was the color of weak apology. "How long?" he said. "Before I started paying attention, or before I sent the signal?" "Both." I clocked the rhythm around 9:15. Sent at 9:22, approximately. He worked that out. 7 minutes between when I'd noticed and when I'd told him. 7 minutes where I'd been watching and listening and building my picture. I had him at 9:11, Ellis said. Felt him before I saw him. Which is the weird part. "That's not weird," I said. "Tell me it's not weird," he said. "It's 11 years of practice. Yours got to the same place in 18 months. That's not weird. That's competence." He looked at that for a while, turned the mug in his hands. The slight tremor was less visible now, the adrenaline moving through and past. He had something in his lapel, Ellis said. A wire or something. I couldn't confirm, but I thought he did. I said. He was running comms. Whatever he was doing there, he wasn't doing it alone. And someone on the other end changed his instructions. Ellis processed this. The digesting of it. The understanding that the morning hadn't been a misread, hadn't been his nerves manufacturing a threat from a bored tourist. The morning had been exactly what it had felt like. A man with a radio in his lapel and both hands in his pockets who had been there for a specific purpose and had left when that purpose was amended. "What do you think the purpose was?" Ellis said. "I think we don't need to know," I said. "I think the fact that it resolved the way it did is enough information." He looked at me. "That doesn't answer my question, Sergeant." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't. I've thought about that question in the days since. I'm still thinking about it. And I'm going to tell you what I actually believe, which is not necessarily what I told Ellis in the anteroom. I believe the man in the gray coat was reconnaissance, not an immediate threat. The hands coming out of the pockets empty was the tell, eventually, when the radio changed his brief. But reconnaissance is its own category of threat, and it doesn't require the hands to come out of the pockets to be dangerous. Reconnaissance is patient. It gathers. It builds a picture over multiple visits, multiple positions, multiple small observations. What it needs more than anything is time and the appearance of ordinariness. What interrupted it? What changed the brief in his lapel radio? I don't know. I'll probably never know. The security architecture around what I do and where I do it means that information doesn't travel toward me. It travels elsewhere into systems I don't have access to and processes I'm not party to. That's appropriate. That's correct. But I believe something interrupted him. And I genuinely believe this, that part of what interrupted him was two guards standing absolutely still and absolutely connected, sharing a frequency that nobody outside of it could hear. I believe he felt the watching before he saw it. And I believe that feeling changed something in his calculation. There's a conversation I have occasionally, not often, and not publicly about what this job actually is. The version most people know is the ceremonial one. The image on the postcard, the bearskin and the scarlet and the unsmiling face and the tourist with their camera at the angle that says, "Look, he didn't blink." That version is real. The ceremony is real and it matters. It's not performance in the dismissive sense. Ceremony is a form of meaning-making. It says, this matters enough to do it with precision. It says, some things deserve to be done the same way, every time, in the same clothes, with the same steps, because consistency is a form of statement. But under that version, beneath the image on the postcard, is the other thing. The listening. The accumulated years of attention. The knowledge of what a safe crowd sounds like versus what a not safe crowd sounds like. The knowledge of what ordinary breathing sounds like, and what it sounds like when it's carrying weight it wasn't designed for. The knowledge of where to look without appearing to look, and what to listen for in the sounds that aren't quite sounds. This is not decoration. This is not ancient pageantry persisted past its purpose. This is a very sophisticated early warning system staffed by human beings with 11 years, or 18 months, of calibration in their nervous systems. Underestimate it at your peril. 3 days after the morning with Ellis and the gray coat, I was completing my post-incident notes, the private log I keep separate from the official documentation, in a notebook with a cracked spine that I've been using since the 3rd year of my posting, when I stopped a question I've been stopping at for years. What would have happened if I hadn't been listening? Not a useful question, probably. Counterfactuals aren't policy. You can't build a protocol on what might have been. But I think about it anyway. Ellis had been alone in that experience for what he estimated was 11 minutes before my signal reached him. 11 minutes of managing something by himself with no confirmation that what he was perceiving was real and not his body manufacturing a threat in the quiet. One of the cruelties of the threat response is that it doesn't come with its own validation. Your heart rate rises, your breath shortens, the back of your neck goes cold, but there's no accompanying note that says this is real. Trust it. There's just the sensation. And the sensation on its own, without confirmation, can become very expensive to hold. Ellis told me, in the anteroom, that the worst of it hadn't been the man with the gray coat. It had been the not knowing whether he was right to be afraid. That's the thing that takes the most from you, not the threat itself. The threat, when it's real, activates all your training, and you run the training, and the training holds. The thing that hollows you out is the doubt. The 11 minutes of carrying fear alone, and not knowing if the fear is calibrated correctly or if you're a 22-year-old man with 18 months and who's misreading a tired tourist. The signal I sent him, the barely there micro shift that says I see it too, I'm here, hold, wasn't tactically significant in the end. The threat resolved before protocol needed to escalate. But Ellis said it was the most important thing that happened that morning. Not because it changed the situation, because it answered the question. I've been a sergeant for 4 years. Before that, a corporal for 3. Before that, a guardsman trying to figure out why this job was teaching me things I hadn't signed up for. Things about attention, about patience, about the specific quality of listening that comes when you stop waiting to respond and start simply receiving. I think about the men and women who taught me that. The older guards with their cold tea and their almost nothing conversations. I understand now what they were doing. They were passing something that doesn't have an instruction manual. Something that lives in the ear rather than the manual. Something you can't be briefed on in the formal sense. You can only be near it long enough that it becomes you. I went back to my post the following morning. The sky was the same stubborn, non-committal gray. The tourists were in their usual rotation. Families, school groups, the lone photographers waiting for the light. The umbrella man was back. He'd changed his pitch. Now he was also selling small Union Jack flags on sticks, which seemed either admirably entrepreneurial or a sign of something I didn't want to think too hard about. The gate, the railings, the sound of a city working around a fixed point. I stepped into position. I became the position, and I started listening. Ellis was at the adjacent post that morning. Good man, Marcus Ellis. Better than he knows yet. Carrying things already that most people never develop the capacity to carry. Carrying them in 18 months when it took me 4 years to find the same quiet. He'll be standing where I'm standing in a decade, counting the new one's breathing patterns, measuring the rhythm, noticing when something is wrong. Passing the thing that doesn't have a name. About halfway through the first hour, I heard him settle into his rhythm. Found his pace, found his breath. The clean, unhurried, measured breath of a man at his post. Steady, contained, present. The breath of someone who has been through something and come out the other side knowing what they're made of. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The crowd moved. The city made its noise. A child pressed her face against the railing and fogged the metal with her breath and laughed at the fog. A man tried to make Ellis laugh by doing an impression of someone doing an impression of a soldier, and Ellis remained magnificently himself. The sky held its cloud. The gate held its ground. And somewhere in London, in a gray coat, with an unidentifiable face and hands that had come out of his pockets empty, a man was carrying different information than he'd had the morning before. The information that 2 people had been paying attention. The information that the stillness had eyes in it. The information that what looks like a postcard is sometimes underneath something else entirely. I still don't know what he was there for. I still think about it. On the long, slow shifts when the city is doing its ordinary things and the threat level is where it usually is and the work is the work of presence rather than response. I turn it over. The gray coat, the lateral step, the lapel radio, the weight shifting forward, the decision not to become the thing it was deciding whether to be. I'll keep turning it over. That's the job, really, not the standing still. Though you do that too, for hours in the cold for 4,000 shifts, until your body knows the post the way it knows its own skeleton. Not even the listening, though you do that until the listening becomes instinct, becomes almost mystical in its precision. The job is the accumulated weight of paying attention. For 11 years. For the 4,000th time. In the gray London morning. For the 22-year-old man in the adjacent box who is afraid and correct to be afraid and managing it with everything he has. You listen. You send the signal. You let him know he is not in it alone. That's all. That's everything.